Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this EPC Policies Dialogue on how to promote the economic recovery and the green and digital transitions in the EU disadvantaged regions. My name is Marta Pilati. I'm policy analyst at the EPC, where I work mostly on regional and economic policy. I have the pleasure to moderate today's event. I'm joined today by five great panelists. We have Normunds, Popens, Deputy Director General of DG Regio, the European Commission, Erik Bergkvist, member of the European Parliament and notably of the Regio Committee, Alison, who is Senior Advisor on Regional Policy, Innovation, Industrial Growth here at the European Policy Centre, Gaetano Armao, who is Vice President of the Sicily region, and David Minton, who is Director of Northern and Western Regional Assembly in Ireland. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. This event will last 2 hours. We will begin with the insights of our two regional representatives for about 10 minutes each, which will be followed by reactions from the other speakers. I will then already take some questions from the audience at that time to discuss the presentations. So feel free to already start asking questions soon. Then we will have a panel discussion, and again, I will be taking questions from the audience. Members of the audience can ask questions in two ways. You can raise your virtual hand by clicking on the button, and I will then give you the floor and you can ask your question orally, or you can type the question in the Q&A box and then I will read it out loud. In this case, please try to be concise. So it's easier for me to read them. Let's kick off. So it's clear that EU regions are highly diverse, different levels of economic development, different economic structure, societal structures, and face a variety of challenges and different development paths. The COVID-19 pandemic and related economic crisis have the potential, unfortunately, to widen the existing disparities among EU regions, because those who are already disadvantaged tend to be, for example, less resilient to crisis. They could struggle more to recovery and have to go through a longer distance to reach a sustainable prosperity. In this event, we will look at these challenges, but most importantly, at the solutions on how to get things on the right track. EU funding is largely available for these regions and presents indeed an opportunity for disadvantaged regions to spur the recovery and catching up process. We will also discuss how to make best use of this funding and how to make the existing architecture work best. We will start, as I said, with the insights from the regions directly. I will give the floor to David Minton from the Northern and Western region of Ireland. David, please, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Marta. Thank you for passing it over to me. I'm just going to try and share my screen quite briefly,
sure.
And hopefully it works.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I suppose firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the EPC for the invitation this morning, and particularly to our colleague and friend, Alison for the invitation. I'm looking forward to, I suppose, hearing and exchanging views from colleagues throughout the morning. As Marta said, my name is David Minton. I work as Director for the Northern and Western region of Ireland. If anybody is looking to connect with us, you can log on to our website on nwra.ie, or my Twitter handle is there if there's any questions after the conference, or as usual, if I speak too fast and I miss something, you're more than welcome to send me a question or a comment or an observation, constructive or critical. Unlike Marta has introduced the colleagues on the panel this morning, but unlike my good colleagues on the panel, I'm not and don't claim to be an industry expert or an innovation leader. But I am fortunate with my colleague Dennis Kelly to kind of lead a band of kind of a rogue band sometimes of passionate custodians overseeing the strategic and sustainable development of our region. And we always kind of claim that we share the values around a sense of place and identity that's both Irish and most importantly European. Most people on the call would be familiar with Ireland's kind of recent, or well, not so recent economic success. And despite the crash of our kind of famous Celtic tiger, Ireland would still be seen as an economic engine. And if you're not familiar with this, you can Google it. I've only got 10 minutes and 10 minutes to do this presentation. And unfortunately, we're about 10 years still analysing the crash of the Irish economy. And I'm not going to get into that today, but I will focus on the positives. And I suppose our successful economy has many traits. And what we always kind of say is there's 4 primary characteristics for us that would include, I suppose, firstly, one of the primary characteristics of our economy certainly is that we are one of the most open economies in the OECD. We have a strong export record, which includes the likes of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and software-related goods and services. And we obviously have a very strong FDI record too, which is increasingly coming under EU scrutiny. Secondly, very much a knowledge-intensive services and high-tech manufacturing economy. They're some of the key drivers behind some of our growth. And, we have to give great credit to the government and the policymakers and practitioners in some of our state agencies and national departments for their role in fostering this kind of national ecosystems agencies such as Enterprise Ireland, the IDA, and Údarás na Gaeltachta. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, I suppose innovation has been a cornerstone of our success, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years. We've built a strong, growing reputation for kind of scientific excellence, particularly, I suppose, most concentrated in our urban areas and acutely concentrated on the east coast of Ireland and Dublin, which I'll touch on shortly. But I think it's important to remember, I suppose, Ireland invested a lot of its structural funds in its people. That's why we have very, very successful people driving on very poor infrastructure, both rail, road, and air connectivity. So we've smart people traveling in bad roads. But I suppose we also consider ourselves, and the fourth pillar is, I suppose, one of the leading research, development, and innovation locations in the world. And we've been able to, I suppose, create an environment that attracts global leaders in key high-tech industries such as pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, medical devices, and of course we've been really seen as a European hub in medical devices and financial services nationally. However, I suppose this masks something else in the sense that there's a very uneven pattern of economic success, where some areas of the country are benefiting significantly less than our capital region. And this presents a less positive kind of micro picture of economic success. And that's kind of what I want to touch on for this 10 minutes. I want to share experience briefly and outline some of the actions we are taking to kind of grapple with these challenges, particularly with a focus on the twin green and digital transition. And like a lot of you on the call today, we don't necessarily see it as kind of twin processes, but we see it an opportunity for a kind of integrated framework to leverage the principles around the Green Deal at a European level, but also shifts in government policy within our member state. I suppose it's important to note, and I'll leave this picture here for a second as I talk through this, but it's important to note that the governance of Ireland's public policy making environment is strongly characterised by a top-down approach. Ireland produced a smart specialisation strategy for the EU's 2014-2020 programme, 2014-2020 programming period, and it adopts a highly centralised and research-driven focus. And this approach is not without success, as I mentioned just there in relation to our national economy. But a review commissioned by the European Commission and conducted by Alison Hunter in 2018-2019 referred to some of Ireland's economic and industrial policy as being place blind, which is an extremely interesting term. And what we've seen then in recent years is during the period of 2018-2020, Ireland also adopted its first national planning framework from a spatial perspective and 3 subsequent regional, spatial and economic strategies at NUTS 2 level. So Ireland has 3 NUTS 2 regions, the Eastern and Midland, the Southern region, the Northern and Western region. And each one of those regional assemblies, which is our regional tier of government, adopted a regional, spatial and economic strategy. And I suppose how did we do is the question, albeit only adopted since 2020. It's, I suppose, frustratingly from our perspective, Ireland is often perceived as a kind of a small country by policymakers with very little kind of discernible geographical or industrial. And I suppose ultimately we're still very heavily relying from a regional perspective on the enabling conditions from cohesion policy to maintain a national commitment to sub-national smart specialisation. our national strategy is for S3 and S4 is currently under review, but we're still very hopeful, and I'll tell you why in a second, about that we will have a very strong regional S3 component. So what have we done at a regional level? You know, we've mobilized our innovation players and began a process or a dialogue in relation to smart specialization for the 21-2027 period. We've conducted in-depth socioeconomic analysis, mapping, and at a granular level. And we've commenced, or we had attempted to commence, a kind of an entrepreneurial discovery process using cohesion policy and the Green Deal as our, I'll flick this here, as our framework, and using I suppose the Green Deal as a framework and a catalyst for a discussion. And that's why Europe for us and its commitment to the regions is invaluable from a regional perspective in Ireland. And you know, the best summation I've seen of the EU Green Deal is actually from a report I read yesterday, which stated that the European Green Deal provides a timely North Star for a prosperous and sustainable Europe. And that's a very nice term for us, because it is essentially from a regional perspective. When you see maybe a reluctance at a national level within member states to focus on, I suppose, a coherent approach to territorial and industrial policy, that you have a Green Deal that and cohesion policy that is encouraging that connection. So really, I think that term around a North Star is probably the best summation I've seen. And I suppose what that means for me really is that, I suppose, earlier than expected, we're going to be confronted with a choice, whether to only treat the symptoms of the existing pandemic, but also the mistakes of the past, or are we going to take the opportunity and create a paradigm shift to prepare against future shocks? And I suppose very clearly what we're planning for in the Northern Western region is going to be that paradigm shift. But we have significant challenges. And some of this slide will just gives a kind of a high level overview of some of those challenges. But from my perspective, there's a startling and kind of widening chasm of regional inequality in Ireland. On many simple measures, even if we just take gross domestic product of each resident, Ireland is one of the most regionally unequal economies across the EU. And this is most acutely felt in our region in the west and the border area. And these difficulties are reflected in the European Commission's decision to downgrade the Northern Western region from a more developed region to a transition region post-2020, the only region in Ireland to hold such a status. And in addition, then, the European Parliament's Committee on Regional Development has categorised the region as a lagging region, which is a region characterised by extremely low growth, which is divergent from the rest of the country. And I won't get into the economic analysis around that, but I think most people on the call are familiar with the categorisations. And I suppose compounding this, signals from internal work that we're doing indicate that this region can be expected to experience a more complex and long-term recovery from the current pandemic crisis. And I suppose the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, instead of, once the categorization of region and transition was allocated to us, instead of accepting the category, what we did was try to understand the reasons and the mechanics around why that was happening to this region. And we published a report which is available on our website, A Region in Transition, the Way Forward. And that looks at a legacy of underinvestment by our member state, and maybe a lack of coherent investment as well in the region to be able to address it. So that report is available on the website. But I suppose importantly, we needed to ask ourselves the question, you know, are we being left behind, and what do we do about it? And as a peripheral region, we know that innovation is key to maintaining competitiveness and thereby providing employment and sustainable growth in our economy. I suppose it's important that we recognise that innovation is crucial to creating and maintaining high-level jobs and attracting, developing and nurturing business, scientists, researchers, innovators and people like who are on this call today into the region to be able to create sustainable growth. And I think it's always important, and it's a message that we always try and communicate, that poor regions are poor not because they have, I suppose, large numbers of poor people, but because they have small numbers of high income people. And this is something that we really need to try and address. So I suppose I'm conscious of a very short time frame, and I'll finish here shortly. I suppose through our own discovery process, and I'm leaning on terms associated with S3 here, you know, which looked at kind of similar bottom-up regional approaches in Denmark, Germany, and Scotland over the past 4 or 5 years. we really looked at other similar types of economies in peripheral regions who were grappling with similar challenges, I suppose, both systemic challenges in the member states, but also similar economic challenges at a regional level. And I suppose we started to have a conversation about trying to pursue a much more aggressive smart specialization approach, and also by presenting the evidence to the member state to be able to having a kind of a co-productive exercise that we can try and bring the member state with us on a journey that would see the Northern Western region used as possibly a pilot in adopting a much more aggressive, I suppose, S3 approach. So we begun by looking at opportunities associated with the twin transition, for example, provision of digitization services that align more with national and EU priorities. We really wanted to focus and build on and exploit existing investments in digital innovation hubs, data analytic initiatives, and other regional development programs. I suppose, in effect, to try and create a multiplier effect and an economies of scale by bringing together a kind of a weight of clusters. And then I suppose finally focusing on, I suppose, expertise within, I suppose, spaces where we see a strategic opportunity in circular economy to align again with national, EU and international commitments. And I suppose to finish, we've done it through a number of steps, which I think maybe just we'd like to share with you to finish off. I suppose the most important step that we took was maybe taking a step back, and that was advice that was given to us by we essentially acquired, and I hope Alison doesn't mind me defining her as a kind of a Sherpa or a guide on the smart specialization process. So Alison Hunter did a review nationally back in 2018, 2019, and we had a really positive experience in working with Alison, who was able to ask us the challenging questions in actually what we wanted to do in relation to S3. And Alison has begun working with the region since late towards the end of 2020, and we published a dialogue piece on smart specialization in the region towards the end of 2020, a kind of a discussion paper. And that discussion paper allowed us to engage with all of the innovation stakeholders in the region. So instead of going and looking at a smart specialization strategy, the advice that we took was to go back 2 or 3 steps and actually start having a dialogue to make sure that we're bringing all the quadruple helix stakeholders with us. And that process kind of led us to building a consortium across the quadruple helix that was successful in being selected as an acceleration program with the OECD in relation to innovation diffusion. And I suppose, because of that dialogue piece and the paper that Alison Hunter helped the region develop, we were able to bring together an entire consortium across our NUTS 2 region for a recent call in relation to European Digital Innovation Hub. So we actually essentially put together the largest consortium of partnerships in Ireland to be able to ensure or try and ensure that we're successful in securing a digital innovation hub for the region. And then finally, I suppose we're equipped now with a very strong bottom-up process to be able to commence, a level of engagement with our member state, who are now reviewing the national smart specialization strategy as an enabling condition for EU structural funds. But we really don't want the structural funds to be a reason to why our member state engages in this process. We wanted to be able to address, I suppose, some of the key issues that we have in relation to our industrial transition, and particularly the fact that we are a lagging industrial region. And to finish, I suppose, on a very optimistic, we are very optimistic about the future, because we have adopted an integrated spatial and economic policy at a regional level that was crafted really by the principles around the Green Deal. And our vision is very clearly to be a regional leader in green and smart practices, with clear objectives that focus on compact growth, sustainable development, investing in people, and transition to a low carbon economy with a focus on advanced technology and data. And that's going to see us looking at pillars around energy, technology, social, economic, spatial, and ecological, and looking at champions of change really in each of those sectors, both from industry perspective, public policy, public institutions, and also community. But I'm just going to finish on this slide, Marta, and I'm going to, this is a very quickly, it's a journey across 100 years. These are both the same locations, a part of the region that I'm from in Galway. One is a small house that had 14 children born into it, and 13 of them had to emigrate, which is the picture at the bottom. And this picture up on top was taken last Saturday And I don't know if anybody, if people can turn on their voice or turn on their microphones, but if anybody can guess what this mapping is, we'll send them a small prize. You can see the red and blue and white lines, and it probably demonstrates our I suppose the level of innovation that's going on in the northern and western region. Maybe I'll put maybe I'll put Alison under pressure and see if she can guess what that might be.
Yeah, the audience is muted, so I'm afraid they will not.
Okay, that's okay. Well, that map up above is a map of drone deliveries that happened in a small village outside of our main metropolitan area of Galway City. It's a small village of Oranmore, which is a map of drone deliveries that happened last Saturday morning. And if you can see the white line on the right-hand side actually connects up to my parents' home, where we were able to deliver my mother's favorite Haagen-Dazs of chocolate chip last Saturday morning in the space of 2.5 minutes from order to delivery, with a small company that's received backing through some of our enterprise agencies, and has been a recipient, I suppose, of some of the industrial policy that we've been able to adopt at a regional, local level in Ireland. But that just shows, I suppose, maybe the rapid change over 100 years. And I suppose it begs the question, where are we going to be in another 100 years' time? So thank you, Marta. That's just an opportunity to share our experience in the northern and western region of Ireland.
Thank you very much, David, for these interesting insights on the challenges that you've been facing, but also on what you're planning and how you're using smart specialization, especially. We might come back to innovation in the panel discussion, but now let me turn to Gaetano Armao from the Sicily region, who also will present for about 10 minutes. Gaetano, please, the floor is yours. You will have to unmute your microphone. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be with you in this important meeting today. I am honored to participate as a speaker in this debate because of the importance of the topic, the level of the speakers, and authoritativeness of the structure that has organized and hosts this debate. The European Policy Center, one of the main think tanks for analysis and debate on the problem of Europe. It often happens that the debate of ideas and confrontation is understandable, and above all, we forget that it's only from in-depth analysis of social and political situations that proposal and solution to problems are conceived. No region left behind is the topic on which we have the pleasure to discuss today. No one should be left behind. We might have, starting from the pillar of the European Union, constituted by the cohesion codified in the Article 174 of the Treaty on the Functions of the European Union, which states in its first two paragraphs, in order to promote its overall harmonious development, the Union shall develop and pursue its actions leading to the strengthening of its economy, social and territorial cohesion. In particular, the Union shall aim at reducing disparities between the levels of development of various regions and backwardness, the less favored region. In the cohesion lives the spirit that gave birth of European Union, the idea of Europe of equal opportunities, where every person and every territory is guaranteed equally starting conditions, as well as equal opportunities to measure and test their ideas and abilities. The pandemic, COVID-19, has certainly complicated the European path towards cohesion by weakness even more than weakest people, social groups, and territories. Some territories in particular have been more damaged by the pandemic because the pre-COVID economic structures, like Sicily, for example, and employment indicators were already much weaker, and obviously serious damage creates repairable effects in a strong structure and irreparable damage in the weak structure. The sound damage is not caused for you take 1 out of 10, or if you take 10 out of 100. For this reason, European funds for all measures resulting from the pandemic crisis cannot and must not be commensurate and proportional to the damage, but must take into account in an additional parameter the economic and geographical difficulties of the place where they intervene. However, this difficulty could turn into an opportunity if there is a determinant will be benefit those social and territorial areas and sectors towards which the future of Europe, we will see the next step of the future of Europe meeting for Europe must be direct, such as the green development and digitalization. The debate did not fail to include a position contrary to the principle of cohesion, which is in my country, is present in some areas and where more developed region. That is the thesis according to which it would not be worthwhile to invest in economically less structured places that will be enabled to make the most of that aid. And that is still bringing development to areas that are already developed, produce a great multiplier of growth. This is selfish thesis, certainly, but above all, it is erroneous and harmful even for the rich regions that should support it. In fact, in my country, unfortunately. In fact, it does not take into account the fact that unbalanced development will lead to an economy of assistance in the less developed areas and thus into the dragging of weaker areas. The already mentioned Article 174 of TFEU says it in a very effective way in order to promote its overall harmonious development. This is the objective we must set ourselves, not all to the overall and quantitative development, but the harmonious and qualitative development. The European Union, that with determination is committed to overcoming the crisis caused by the pandemic phenomenon, at the same time is going to face the most important challenges for this future. We will most likely be judged by the future generation on how we achieve the transition to green and digital Europe is the issue of today. Our ability and willingness to build a carbon neutral Europe capable of using a new class of technologies will be the measures of our success or our failure. An entire European political class across differences will receive the historical judgment on whether we achieve those goals. The founding fathers of Europe, like De Gasperi, Adenauer, Schuman, set themselves the goal of building it in a sketching our out of Greek project. This generation has a duty to strengthen and lead it along the path of 6 priorities by the Commission for 2019-2024 and indicated the entire planet the objectives of the environment, digital work, international security, rights, and democracy. And when we say no region left behind, we must also say no area of the world left behind. Europe, which must be stronger in the world, must promote multilateralism and commit itself to guarantee a world order based on rules, rights, and overcoming the tragedy of poverty and hunger. Returning to Europe, never have we found ourselves in a historical moment in which all resources come into play. Considering the long-term budget of the next generation EU, Europe is putting resources in more than 1.8 billion euros into the pipeline. There are all conditions to create levels of development capable of overcoming the worst effects of this crisis due to the COVID-19 and initiate the green and digital transition, and do all this within the perimeter of economic, social, and territorial cohesion. The EU, through the Commission, has demonstrated to be looking to the future by launching measures of significant financial impact and proving capable and overcoming an initial national selfish. If we want to act effectively for our people and business, we must avoid bureaucratic silos and over-centralization and encourage more pan-European coordination. This is the aim. The Conference on the Future of Europe is a good occasion to improve the functioning of EU democracy. Now is the time to ensure that in addition to national and EU authorities, regional and local authorities are recognized once and for all as one of the three dimensions of European house democracy. This is the perspective of declaration of the European Committee of the Region and local and regional authorities as actor of the European response to the COVID-19. COVID-19 pandemic shows both a vulnerability of EU's functioning and the extent to which EU member states and EU citizens are connected. The EU can only resolve this crisis and any future crisis in all levels of government, EU, national, regional, and local levels, economic and social actors, citizens, and in the EU take their responsibilities. Declaration that highlights that the impact of underrepresented crisis, local and regional finances could seriously undermine the capacity of local and regional authorities to meet an increased demand of health, sanitary and social services for citizens, public transport, education, and other public services, as well as for economic incentives to local business and for implementation of action towards the sustainability and climate neutrality. We are at the cross. We can tackle this crisis by looking at Europe and the role of regions with a correct multi-level approach. And this is the only path to the development. This crisis and the opportunities it offers can be tackled by a statistical bureaucratic approach, and failure will be assured. The less developed regions of the European Union have the possibility of reversing their development models more easily than more developed regions. And the transition to the new model is facilitated by the weakness in those territories of previous models. This is another reason why it's necessary to focus on maximum territorial cohesion, ensuring homogeneous development throughout the EU territory. With regard to the cohesion, I would like to raise one of the issues to which also because on my territorial regions, I am very attached, that insularity. As president of the region intergroup for insularity of the European Committee of Region, I am aware that living in an island determined by itself a structural vulnerability that penalizes every aspect of one's way of life. The distance from many mainland regions and economic environment is strongly conditioned by additional island production costs, higher transportation costs to and from the mainland, highly increased territorial and marine biodiversity are just a few aspects of an additional difficulties experienced by islanders compared, excuse me, other citizens. The risk is the insular territories and those who live in them will be left behind because the disadvantage resulting from their insularity. The regional intergroup...
Sorry, may I just ask you to wrap up if that's possible, thanks. And then we can go back to some of the points in the discussions. Thank you.
I'm finished. I'm finished, thank you very much. On insularity, it's important for the European Union to focus its attention in application on 174 article. Creating a post-pandemic Europe that is greener, more digital, and ready to the future challenges must give the 2,000 islands and 17 millions of European citizens who live there and a special attention required by law. Climate change is forcing a profound revolution in their way we think, act, and we must rise to the occasion. The year of equal opportunities in which no one is left behind is the Europe that knows how to turn every difference into an asset and that sees its own internal borders and signs of confronting sculptures. This is the homeland Europe on which one of the founding fathers, Alcide de Gasperi, spoke in 1954 at the Parliamentary Conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaetano, for your insights and your visions for the future. I will now give the chance to the other three speakers to react to these two contributions. And I remind the audience that if you have any questions, please feel free already to type them in, and I'll make sure to come to those later on. Erik, let's start to you, please, if you have any first thoughts.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this event, which I think is exactly the right timing for it when we are trying to finish the last things of the budget and the next generation EU, and has to start to rebuild, to restart Europe again. And also thank you to David and Gaetano for really interesting presentations, which for me is a reminder that actually we can have any ideas and plans we want on the EU level or a national level, but everything actually happens locally. And if we are to succeed, and I think that's been clear in both of your presentations, if we are to succeed, we have to work on a multi-level basis. And the region is, I would say, the perfect jigsaw bit in this, because it's close to the local area, can coordinate that, and it's close to the national, and also my own experience as being a regional leader for more than 10 years, it's very close to the EU level. So you have all the connections and you are the perfect spider in the web. And I would say we are facing really challenges now. I would say we saw the writing on the wall already before the pandemic, but I think it made it really, really clear how dependent we are on each other, and also how things affect not just one country, one region, one area. It affects us all, and it's especially clear when it comes to pandemic, but also when it comes to economic issues, which is a consequence of the pandemic situation, that actually not just the EU or Europe is going down, the whole world is going down in a catastrophic low economic activity, and we have to find ways now to restart them. And this is also one thing that we can't allow ourselves to fail, because there are so many things at stake if we don't get hope back, if we don't get companies running, if we don't get people back to work. We saw that before, that we have problems, and in a way we are back, and we have to start to discuss the fundamentals from why we once started a European Union or coal and steel union. And it was two things: to ensure democracy and to ensure a peaceful development. And we are back there now. Luckily, a lot have happened, but these are the things that actually are at stake now. And if we don't succeed with fighting this pandemic, if we don't succeed with creating jobs, if we don't succeed with fighting the climate change, then these things are at stake and a prosperous, peaceful development. And some things, I'm very glad when I hear these regions, because they have a plan, they have ideas, they will be very well suited once the money, which must happen really quickly and swiftly and as easy as possible, get distributed from next generation EU and also from the cohesion policy, which I would say that the name cohesion policy is more suitable than ever, because basically what it is all about is keeping the European Union together and not allowing regions, countries to diverge in development, in welfare, for their citizens. Because when we see these tensions arise, that's also when we see that this project we have together, which we have to have together because each country and region is too small, then this will start to squeak and crumble. And we can't afford that in the world as it looks today. And there are some basic things that we have to also see that they are working. Broadband, for example. It's not working in every region. It's not fast enough in every region. And if we have to have a green and digital Europe in front runner in the world, well, these basic things have to work. If we have to have a 5G in all of Europe, we need a broadband in all of Europe. If we have to have prosperous companies, citizens living a good life, we need a green energy supply in all of Europe. So some of these basic things we cannot forget, and we have to see through that they actually are working. In those cases, I'm not worried. I'm glad to hear these regions. I have lots of contacts with regions. I know there are lots of plans. But if we don't include the regions for real in a multi-level governance, then we will not succeed as good as we have to succeed. So we shall not leave any region behind, and we cannot leave any region behind, because Europe's welfare is no more, but it's no less either than actually the success of every region. And after the post-pandemic party, which will break out when this is all over, we have to realize that the world is still full of challenges that we have to tackle one by one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. We shall come back to some of those points in the discussions. Normunds, over to you, please, for your first thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you to you and to the EPC for inviting me and having initiated this debate. It's extremely important because, as you know, we are, of course, putting in place now the future generation of post-2020 programs under the cohesion policy funds. But we also have a range of new instruments created which will help us to get through the crisis, come back to the sustainable development path. But in this context, obviously, the regional or place-based approach becomes very important. And also for my commissioner, Elisa Ferreira, helping the less developed regions as we categorize them under cohesion policy, but mostly looking at different types of regions who have different types of disadvantages. I like your term, by the way, and we are searching for the new term for this, our initiative, which we used to call the lagging and then catching up regions. And now we realize we need something more positive. So this is close to the heart of my commission, and we are currently going also through the reflection phase of how to better target assistance that is available there. And we have been providing for decades to different regions, but how we can target it better and work really together with these regions to understand what are the real needs where the European Commission can also come in with the assistance and knowledge that we have through various instruments. I want to just say quickly that I'm happy to hear from regions that they are mentioning a few things which are important. Obviously, it's very important to understand that the European Green Deal is for everyone. It is not just about, the top-down approach, setting the beautiful targets at EU level. There is a realization all across the Commission, but also the EU, that we will succeed only if all actors at the multi-level governance will be involved. And there we talk about regional levels, we talk about municipal levels, our urban authorities, different territorial authorities going down to the local levels. And I think there is a realization that this is about helping these different territories to get on this growth. But when I talk about growth, I want to stress that also for the first time, we are not talking about the growth at any price. We are talking about the growth which is sustainable, smart, inclusive, but that will also not damage the planetary boundaries within which we all have to live in. So this is called green and digital transition. And I think it shows that we have to also rethink sometimes these basic paradigms, such as a GDP growth per any price. We still need growth, of course, in some parts of Europe and world for sure, but we also have to, I think, have a chance to make it a win-win situation so that it doesn't damage the Earth and planetary boundaries. Now, what we concretely will do is, of course, our first aim is to help everybody to get out of the crisis. I mean, the crisis is huge. It has impact, as some of previous speakers have said. We have mobilized all the cohesion policy remaining funds for the current period under the CRE initiative, Corona Response Investment Initiative, more than 16 billion already reprogrammed. And we deploy every possible flexibility to help us to sustain the crisis. And on top of that, the new instrument REACT-EU from Next Generation EU will also be programmed on the basis of current programs to make it easy and simple to absorb. And there, of course, it will go out to member states and regions and on the current programming architecture, which includes many, many regional programs which will receive additional funding. But at the same time, I want to say that we also, and as was our Commission President who said it very well, we will emerge stronger from the crisis, but not if we just correct and invest in the mistakes of the past, in the correction of those mistakes. We need to invest into future. And this is why, of course, REACT-EU should be also seen as a bridge to the next generation of our programs. And in our new programs in post-2020, we have very clear policy objectives. So we still want to see innovation and research to be as a driver for economic development. This is why it's policy objective number one. And there, our Irish colleague said about smart specialization. We want these strategies. This is a concept we have put in forward many years ago. It works. We see that it allows different regions to do innovation, to help their economies. And we need to go more regional. I fully agree that Ireland is a classical case where you have a development which is very beautiful at a national level, GDP growth. When you start looking further, the problems start to appear. Regional disparities are growing. There are regions which still are very poor and rural, and they don't know what to do. And this is what we need to do. By the way, country who has regional programs, I would call them fake regional programs because they are centrally managed. So we need to make sure that the national governments are with us. We want to make a change to the next generation of programs, but it needs a work. We have very clear commitment to do green and digital transition through policy objectives 2 and 3. It is clear this is part of thematic concentration, particularly everything related to energy efficiency, environment, climate change. But what we have done, of course, is also we have introduced new policy objective, which is territorial-based objective, Europe Closer to Citizens, which allows every region who has specific priorities defined in their strategic documents that we can help them to invest under these priorities. So this is very important mix of thematic and place-based policy objectives under which we can then basically help any region to develop and to get out of crisis and develop further. On top of that, we are putting in place a just transition mechanism which is clearly targeting territories which have problem in this green transition, which are still the biggest polluters. And there we need to maintain, again, the essence of Just Transition Fund is economic diversification, finding new ways of working, living, and providing jobs and welfare to people on those territories. But it is linked to clear commitment of national and regional levels to go through this shift in energy transition and also industrial transition. So again, very important instrument we are putting together. And finally, on top of everything, of course, we have also RRF, Recovery Resilience Facility, which has an important link to reforms because we still see that funding is not everything. There are regions, and I'm sorry, Sicily and other Italian regions in South have been receiving our funding for decades, a lot of funding with their own programs. And still, we see that there, in terms of indicators, there is a stagnation. the disparities are growing even within those regions, not to talk about regions vis-a-vis other parts of their countries. And this is a problem because we cannot then sustain the necessity to put more money under the cohesion. So we see that the link between investment and reforms is extremely important. Of course, we have key enabling conditions put in place for our funds. The Recovery and Resilience Facility will also link reforms together with the investment, but there needs to be a genuine cooperation and a genuine understanding together with those regions. What is exactly that they need? We know we launched already studies with the World Bank, with other think tanks, and we have defined, we know that there are problems which we cannot solve with our programs under cohesion policy. There are problems linked to governance, to labor markets, to education, the link between all those. And these are something where, you know, we've tried to dispatch task forces and hands-on assistance, and we have different instruments available for all regions. But we need to think together, what is it that we are targeting? But first of all, how we define together with those regions, what are the gaps that need to be addressed? We have possibilities to do it together. And I would be looking, you know, for the discussion really very concretely. Should we focus on 2-3 topics that are problematic for those regions? Identify 2-3 concrete bottlenecks, then try to see what we can do in terms of regulatory or legislative change, and then, you know, attach the funding which would follow then to support this. Should we do more reforms in this or that area? Very concretely, I think it's time to go away from generic statements. We know that, you know, there are, you know, different needs everywhere, and look concretely for concrete territory, also looking at this concept of functional territory. We should not see everybody in isolation. More and more we talk about, and we want to support more and more cooperation between different administrative territories. We know that the rural areas cannot survive with cities that are, you know, close to them, and vice versa. There is this functionalism inbuilt in the way that Europe functions, and we need to support that. And again, think in that context. We need to learn from each other as well. I mean, there are solutions that are found in some parts, sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south. And again, this is why we want to come up with something that is a new initiative which would target specific territories and regions, but we need also the genuine help from the same territories, from the national governments, in order to define exactly what are we going to do. Because I think we have to be concrete, we have to link as well our programs to this, and then of course we will succeed, and the future will be bright for everyone. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, and we shall come back to some of these points indeed in the discussion. Alison, I want to turn it to you for your first thoughts, and then I will take a few questions from the audience, please.
Marta, thank you. Thank you everyone for your intervention so far. I couldn't agree more with everything that's been said this morning. So a really, really interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on a few remarks from our first two presenters, though, which I think are critical for this whole agenda. The first being, in the Irish example, we have a rich member state, but the region itself is facing very harsh realities around transition status, low growth since the financial crisis, which is a clear problem, which Normunds has just alluded to. And then also going back to the importance of the 3 EU pillars of social, economic and territorial coherence and convergence and cohesion. And the last of these, the territorial element, still remains the poor cousin. We talk about addressing bottom-up needs, but we have yet to really put the architecture in place to make this work. The existing vulnerabilities, which were noted by Gaetano, I think are utterly important for this discussion, because those existing vulnerabilities in the most disadvantaged places will influence the recovery progress. And for more developed regions, we know that they are going to be better able to accelerate and to recover faster, so we risk an uneven recovery. And we're already looking into the face of this. The EU has a role in, of course, championing this multi-level approach that we've all been talking about. And for me, this is the added value of the European semester, which we haven't really talked about this morning, but is certainly at the core of what we need to do to support the most disadvantaged regions of Europe. And with this comes, just as Normunds had mentioned, the importance of regional and national reforms. And those reforms have to be, first of all, about responding to COVID before we can talk about rebuilding green recovery. Now, this is not necessarily a very popular view because we talk about a green recovery. My own take on this is that we're not going to get there. For these disadvantaged regions, we need a response to what is facing them on the ground now. And I think the things which are deterring that essentially are the lack of a good, strong local evidence base, a bottom-up evidence base of what is actually the reality on the ground. Some of that is because, frankly, the member states are not necessarily listening, which goes back to this space-blind approach. And some of it is actually because regions are not able, they don't quite have the capacity to get that evidence base into place. Now, we saw the example in Ireland, in Northern and Western. They have a great evidence base, but they have the means and the capacity to generate that, while many other disadvantaged regions don't. So there is an issue around the evidence to support the response process, but there is a wider issue around governance. And this brings us back to the reform agenda linked to the European semester. And something that I've started to think about when we talk about reforms, what do we mean by reforms? Well, reforms effectively are on a spectrum of your most basic needs right through to the ones which are related to the twin transition. Now, the ones that are the most basic need reforms are still the things that are about health and social systems, sustaining the financial life support of EU businesses, the broadband connectivity that Erik referred to, and effectively providing a safety net for those who are falling out of the labour market. Now, these things, unless we start to address those now in terms of responding to the crisis, I think we can forget about a green recovery. These things are the core of keeping economies alive, keeping them on the life support that they absolutely need. And the way that we need to do this, I believe, through the facility, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, is to ensure that the regions are actually effectively engaged in that process. And I'm not a big fan of this consultation, bring regions in by consulting with them. Consulting is one thing. It's the acid test is, do we actually see the evidence of need going forward? And to what extent will the European semester, in its relationship now with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, to what extent will it be breathing heavily down the necks of the member states to understand that their evidence bases are indeed the right ones? And what are we going to do to support the governance of those less developed and those most disadvantaged places to make sure that we can actually target investment to them? We've already seen in places like Italy and Spain the political fallout when there is money coming your way, but you don't quite know what to do with it, or you don't quite know where to target those priorities. So I think there is something much, much more fundamental around governance and administrative capacity linked to an evidence base of need at the local level that we need to respond to now if we are going to look to this green, better future. So I'll stop there for now. I could go into that in more detail, but I'm conscious of time, Marta, so we can come back to some of these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for these points. And indeed, I'd like to come back later on to your points on the semester, especially. I want to share with you a question that we got from the audience, from Vlad Maximov. Sorry if I pronounced that wrongly, from Euractiv, and it's about sustainable land use and urbanization. And he states that hundreds of football fields of agricultural natural land are changed to urban use every day. And is there a coherent, the question is, how can we develop a coherent European approach to sustainable land use patterns and managing urbanization? I'm not sure who wants to take this. Let's see, maybe Erik, would you like to take this one on sustainable land use?
Well, it's almost a seminar in its own, this, but I would say. But basically, it is a huge problem, and especially in the more crowded areas where you don't have the land you would need to grow crops and livestock and things like that. But I have problems to see that this is something that we can, in a more precise way, address on an EU level. I think this has to be, and it will be, because countries are very aware of this, and also that it is a national competence. But I think we can do some things on EU level, and that is, of course, to see through that we can develop both crops and livestock breeding in a way that we can sustain that on smaller amounts of land. And also, well, of course, we have to have a certain degree of self-sufficient, but also see how can we actually in other parts of the world help to develop these things that we can benefit from, but also, for example, when we look at Africa, how can we help them with their agriculture? And this is something I would say a little broader beside of the CAP. And since I got a chance, I will also lift in another thing, because this is about helping the regions that have capacity problems. I think Alison put it quite well. But we also have the neighboring regions that are just outside the EU, both in the east, but also in the south. And there, I would say the challenges, to put it mildly, that we have today with people wanting to move to the north, this is just the beginning. And if we cannot participate in a positive development there, the problems we see today will be, I would say, we will remember them as small. And you cannot build the walls high enough. So you have to find some way to have a mutual positive development at the same time as we are handling our own pandemic in the European Union. So I think that was perhaps a little vague answer, but it's a very tough question, but it's a very also, I would say, important question to find solutions to. Thank you.
I would like to come in on
Please,
that,
sure.
if I may.
Please.
No, because we are also, of course, you must have heard that the European Union does have the EU urban agenda. It was established by the Amsterdam Pact some years ago, and just the last year, and with German presidency, we did have a renewed Leipzig Charter. And Leipzig Charter is our guiding light for the future urban development in Europe. It puts in place the principles, different principles of integrated approach, sustainable green cities, all that is reflected in the Leipzig Charter. But it's true that at the EU level, we don't have directives, we don't have an authority to impose on member states and how they, approach city planning and development. But we have a lot of cooperation with our cities. First of all, through our cohesion policy programs, we have an earmarked 8% of ERDS used for integrated sustainable urban development strategies, under which we will, of course, never fund anything which is not corresponding to do no significant harm principle. But the point is that we have 14 partnerships on the EU agenda. Some of them are looking at the land use, they were looking at the housing, at energy, at different problems at the urban level. And we will try to do what we can to actually, through knowledge sharing and showing these good examples of urban planning, to show that it's possible to develop a city in a green and sustainable way. So hopefully that will help in cities in Europe. We have programs in place. We will launch next year as well the new European Urban Initiative, under which we will launch calls for innovative solutions to different problems that our urban areas and cities are facing. We have also the new initiative, the Bauhaus Initiative, which we will try to put some meaning into and some concrete substance, which is maybe not exactly about football fields, but it is about having this all-inclusive process in a city, the use of green materials when you plan, and the rehabilitation of certain urban areas, bringing in also architects, designers, cultural people from the sphere of culture and everything, but also initiatives like that should be a concrete help also to deal with issues like that. But again, we cannot expect that the EU will have a directive on how it needs to be done. It's more through really showing how it can be done that we can, I think, achieve some good results.
Thank you very much. David, I want to come to you with a question from Emily Stewart in the audience, who's asking, you've mentioned a paradigm shift that is in the making. What format do you expect for that? How are you engaging with that, and what are your expectations on engaging with this? And also, I might add, how can the relationships with the central governments made easier? And here I pick up on a question from John Costet, which says, how can we help each other to mobilize national governments to start thinking territorial, place-based, multi-level, bottom-up, and so on? Thank you. You will have to unmute yourself, David. Thanks.
Apologies, Marta. Sorry, I think you gave me the easy question. Thank you for that. I think just picking up on that paradigm shift is probably something that relates back to maybe what Normunds was touching on there about I suppose the seismic shift in policy that's happening at a European level. And I think it's probably remiss of us to look at this solely through the lens of the kind of the urban agenda. And I think the wider EU Green Deal is something that we see as a completely systemic shift, not just in how we practice, but in I suppose culturally as well, about how our communities access the built environment, how we factors such as, say, consumer goods, food, circular economy, all of those elements create a pressure on land use. And I think the point in relation to the use of, we'll say, football fields and I suppose the use of football fields for facilitating urban growth and that trend in urbanization, I think there are some very good practical examples in communities, in cities, across member states, where countries are trying to grapple with that kind of paradigm shift. In Ireland, we can be very critical of some elements of Irish public policy. On the other hand, I think we were probably being looked on back in 2018 by a lot of member states when Ireland published its first national planning framework. And some of the core principles around that were, again, integrating in the what's now the Leipzig Charter, but sustainable urban development practices, but focusing on compact growth and understanding the implications of wider land use. So, focusing on Dublin as our capital city, compact growth in our second tier cities, starting to understand the ecosystem and I suppose the value chains that happen that are creating all of these problems. So I suppose the paradigm shift for me is very much about that systemic shift in thinking, and that has to come at an international level. And I think what the European Commission is doing with the European Green Deal is going to be the pace setter for that internationally. But again, that needs to be elevated up into to across global states, across the OECD. I think one of the reoccurring themes for me that maybe that Gaetano and Normunds and Alison have touched on, and Erik as well, is, I suppose, is the multi-level governance is bringing regions with us. And I think Alison touched on the consultation on the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And, just this morning, we'll say the Irish member state issued its consultation on the Recovery and Resilience Facility with a deadline, I think, of 22nd of February. So that gives us 3 weeks to engage with, 9 local authorities, working with our local government sector across to ensure that nobody is left behind, and to be able to present an evidence base then that can actually demonstrate value for money, because we've an envelope of funds there, about approximately 800 million euros. We have a border area that, when you look at some of the statistics, particularly on the border in the west, we have 3 billion of cross-border trade that's under, increasing threat because of administrative bureaucracy, because of the UK leaving Brexit or leaving the European Union. We've nearly 90,000 businesses along that border region that need to be supported at a territorial level, and we have 3 weeks to be able to prepare something for that. That for us is doesn't strengthen the position of the regions. So look, I don't know if I answered that as well, but that's from our position. systemic shift, but also we need a much more a much stronger commitment at a European level to ensure that member states are complying with the country specific recommendations on an annual basis and actually answering it with metrics.
Thank
Marta,
you very much,
sorry,
David.
Marta,
Yes, please do,
yeah.
Alison.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Sorry. Just to pick up on David's point about the coherence of a response, a multi-level response that's required. I actually want to take this forward a bit, Marta, to one of the questions that I know you had posed for us, which was around a trade-off between the need for speed and local targeting as we think about the plans, the recovery and resilience plans, and with what possible consequences. And I think this is a classic example of this. I mean, I think if we look back to the EU's speed of response at the beginning of this whole crisis, it was nothing short of remarkable. The size of the response even more so. But this has meant that decisions were taken at the highest political levels across the EU, which is understandable. But we now face the prospect of member states retaining a very tight grip on these reins. And I think that remains inevitable for the foreseeable future. So we need to accelerate the efforts to get the plans into place, to get them submitted. And this actually provides a disincentive for member states to take the time for more comprehensive regional engagement. Some might say that provides the perfect excuse for them to do so. But in doing that, we perhaps risk this bottom-up response and the bottom-up evidence base that I mentioned earlier. And in fact, we heard last week in a survey from CAMR that regions had barely been consulted so far in the drafting of these plans. And so there are risks in continuing to follow this top-down approach, a lack of engagement, a lack of buy-in at the regional level, which then of course affects ineffective targeting at the end of the day of the responses and how we can actually move to the implementation phase. So we actually face now quite a challenge in overcoming a tokenistic approach to improving regional engagement and how national governments actually work in many places. Their capacity for improved outreach and flexibility to adopt a more strategic approach really need to be at the core of the effort. And as I said earlier, I do believe that there are teeth that the European semester now has that could actually enable that process. But we need to look at the core reform agenda in order to enable that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And indeed, I want to come to Normunds on targeting. But first, let me just say that I'm made aware that Gaetano had to leave for an unforeseen emergency meeting, and he apologizes for that. So unfortunately, won't be able to come back. But Normunds, we mentioned targeting very often. Let's get a bit more concrete and see how the Recovery and Resilience Facility can indeed put the money where it is more needed, and how does it target the areas and the sectors more in need?
Well, coming from DG Regio, you imagine that in our internal discussions since the very beginning, we have been raising this as an issue also for this new instrument to make sure that there is in our negotiations as member state, this is raised, and becomes one of the necessity to consult different stakeholders and to come back with plans which then can be implemented, because let's face it, in the end they have to be implemented very quickly. So you need to have projects. You cannot absorb all that funding just by some national level projects. You have to go down to regional levels, to all the levels of governance, and really engage all of them to come up with the projects which can be implemented and which also target the real needs which we have now. But like Alison explained it very eloquently, you are faced with a huge dilemma with this instrument. It is supposed to link real reforms, also lessons learned from the pandemics, because you can also target resilience of health systems. You can target with that different forms of, you can help SMEs which have suffered enormously. You can target certain sectors through the RRF, tourism and culture as well. through specific investment into those fields, that normally everything should be linked to some element of a reform. But we know that this is not so easy to be done in such a short time frame. So similarly, also the consultation of all stakeholders is a requirement. It needs to be done, but we have short deadlines. You cannot imagine which deadlines we are facing in terms of analyzing those plans from member states. You know, we have to read them in 2-3 days. So I mean, that's also a challenge. So please try to do the best out of it, make a best out of it. I think the member states have understood necessity to do these consultations, and I think they are trying, but we also need, you know, constructive collaboration in this, because the time pressure is there. The MFF, you know, has certain deadlines imposed on all of us. And I think it's very important what Alison also said about this recovery. I mean, we need to dispatch funds quickly. We've done it with our policy, under cohesion policy. RRF is really an important amount of funding, which is supposed to help every member state and region to get out of crisis. So this is also one of the primary aims. But then, of course, we don't want to lose the link to reforms, the green and digital transition. I still believe that at the same time as getting out of crisis, we can look at the green recovery. I still believe we can achieve the win-win situation, but that is a challenge. So, of course, and I see the Eurocities. Eurocities know me very well. We work with you. You are our most important stakeholder, and we value the involvement of cities. You know, we have created different formats for cities, our own UDN network, the Cities Forum, which we organize every year. We work with you in different groups of experts. We are engaged with you. But again, I mean, when you have a time pressure, there has to be certain understanding that it has to happen within a limited time frame, and this is why, of course, we need to do whatever we can. But there is a requirement, I think, to do that. There is an understanding, as you all say. We just have to work together, also with our national governments, with the Commission and different stakeholders, to make sure that it happens.
Thank you, Normunds. Alison, I want to come to you. What is the role of the European semester in all of this, if any? The semester has been known for targeting more the national level rather than regional, but now there is potentially a chance for reforming the semester in the context also of the recovery facility. What's your take on this?
I think there are ways that this can be done. I mean, let's be honest, the European semester is not something that has been particularly popular with member states for the last years. But there's a new momentum behind the European semester, because there's a recognition with its tie to the recovery package. Then, as I said earlier, it now has some teeth. It's how we use those teeth, I think, that's going to be incredibly important. And I noticed in the guidance provided recently to member states around how they're thinking about their recovery plans, they have to be thinking about what were in the country reports and country-specific recommendations from the last 2 years. Now, I'm delighted to hear that, because 2 years ago, the European semester started its Annex D. It's part of the, I hated the fact that it was an annex, but this was now saying we need to look at divergence. We need to look at fragmentation across member states. And the country reports actually provided some quite clear information to all the member states on where they should be looking. And if you take Ireland was very much focused on research, development and innovation. And this morning we've heard from David how they're starting to tackle that. Italy's was much, much, much more expansive. There were many, many more areas of rather, what I said earlier, basic reform. Now, those Annex D, to be perfectly honest, they were ignored. They were largely ignored by the member states. I think there's a real opportunity now to resurrect them in the plans that are submitted, to look much more carefully at the content and to say, are you really addressing some of these more fundamental reforms that were noted in the last 2 years of the European semester? Last year's was very much about the Just Transition Fund. And while that's enormously important, I think we need to go back 2 years. So for me, I think this would be a great starting point. Let's resurrect the Annex D and actually turn it into something which has teeth and which is actually going to be useful for Europe's regions. Thank you.
Yeah. Erik, Marta, can I comment?
Please do. I was about to come to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. No. First, I think it is absolutely of importance if we are to get more out of money and be more efficient, that we have this true multi-level governance and true multi-level dialogue. In some countries it's working quite well, in some countries not at all. And of course in some countries you don't have a regional level, so then you have to find other ways. And I think, of course, we're always under time pressure, but I think it's worth perhaps some extra week or weeks to be ensured that the regions and hence also the local level is involved in this dialogue. And I think it's especially important now, for example, when we have the Just Transition Fund, which is a national instrument, but it's heavily dependent on regional instruments as the ERDF and the ESF Plus, for example, meaning that we risk actually to centralize things even more, which is not really what we want. And if a country has done this by the book, had the regional dialogue already today, then it's not an extra effort and it wouldn't even take more time. It's just in the case that you don't have this dialogue, it might take more time because you need the routines. So if we need to create more engagement, more precise hit from the money we use, then we have to be really serious about this, and we can do it a little better. Another thing, I think the European semester it's a great instrument. It's efficient. It can improve a lot of things, but still it lacks transparency, and this is a problem because it makes it harder for regions actually to be involved. And I would say quite a lot of the regions have no idea what it really means. And also from a parliament point of view, it lacks transparency. So we can't really be engaged as we would like to be in actually developing the semester, and also to evaluate what is good and what is not working as good as it should be.
Thanks, Erik. David, you wanted to come in? I'm afraid we don't hear you. Could you try to...
Sorry, is that okay?
Yes, that works now. Thanks.
Apologies. Just to pick up very briefly on a point that Erik raised and also Alison, just in relation to, I suppose, to value for money and the targeted investments. I think, I think we need to commend the European Commission for its response to the coronavirus, but also I think, we need to evaluate the responses by member state and maybe learn some very quick lessons, particularly in relation to the response and recovery funds. If you look, particularly in an Irish context, you look at how we spent our React-EU, how we utilized that instrument to respond. Again, we were in a position where our system did not allow for, I suppose, a rapid response by the regions and the local authorities, particularly our urban authorities, to respond to what was a demand by public citizens in relation to town centre regeneration, stimulating SMEs, supporting jobs and employment, where that money, because of the regulatory requirements for it to be spent by a certain time and committed, that money needed to be, was allocated essentially to the purchase of PPE equipment. And, albeit, an extremely valuable investment in PPE equipment on the scale of member state expenditure on PPE equipment in the billions of euros, the small amount of, I suppose, money that was made available to some of these instruments could have been could have created more value by attributing them to actually factors around regional inequality, stimulating economic development. And there didn't seem to be a requirement by member states to really innovatively approach some of these instruments in a better way. So I think I suppose the message here is that we certainly need to evaluate how these instruments were used, and a number of examples across Europe was probably soaked up for the purchases within larger procurement exercises around PPE equipment that ultimately were going to be spent anyway.
Thanks, David. Please.
Yeah, I just you can't imagine what some managing authorities tried to sneak in through the decree amendments that we had to process. purchasing a diesel train apparently is a good contribution to getting out of COVID crisis, or building a local gas network or something. I mean, honestly, the projects that have been there and we didn't support them before, they were all coming back. But I think we did a good job together. Thank you also for your kind words, because in the end we see, and we now have a first summary of key measures, and we also have the first overview of how REACT-EU will look like. And we do see that the money goes out to SMEs, which is good. It supports them, but with certain conditions attached. I think we see a lot on digital, which is an absolute necessity. We see a lot for education, connecting schools, rural places, everything. We also see health being strengthened, building resilience. We still discuss vaccines, how much it should be paid from EU budget. I mean, that is a question I might as well ask you. I mean, for us, it's easy to put an EU flag on every vaccine. It's visible, but when a very rich country tells me I need all the REACT-EU money being put in vaccines, I start to doubt whether that's a value added for the EU budget. And this is where we need to look also at the contribution to green transition and stuff like that. But this is how it works. I think in the end, we can reassure everybody that key measures REACT-EU, they are concrete help to all countries and regions to get out of crisis. We are very flexible. We are targeting them. We see that also regional distribution, even if REACT-EU is a national level instrument, it is taking place. So they are putting money to regional programs. They are putting money to less developed regions, and regions who suffered most from COVID crisis. It is happening. We are reasonably assured. But I think I need to bring in the semester, and Annex D has not disappeared. Annex D still remains. Of course, the COVID crisis might have shifted. We are worried now about the huge amount of investment we apparently need for the health sector. We knew that. Now it's very clear. We are worried about not to lose the whole need to invest in innovation and research through the smart specialization strategies, which might seem, not a priority now in a COVID crisis. But Annex D was the first time when we linked the spending under cohesion policy funds to CSRs, which are country-specific recommendations, agreed at the EU level with member states. And as Regio, now being part of this core group on this process, we also, of course, see that the issues linked to regional disparities and necessity to address these regional disparities are now becoming part of the core business under a semester, which was not the case before, because if you look at CSRs some years ago, mostly was thematic. Now we see that there are CSRs on these regional disparities, on addressing different needs of different regions, and I think it's very good. Annex D is not going to disappear. It's still our guiding light for the future 300 billion or something, which we are programming now under our mainstream programs with everyone around Europe. And there we will be looking at Annex D and the priorities there. Of course, we have to be also flexible and learn from the crisis and lessons that we have. But I can assure you that this link is there and we will put it in place. And similarly, requirement on the consultations with stakeholders. It's true, we are pushing member states to have a more genuine consultation. So not to tick the box, but rather to listen and then come back to us with a changed program. We are working already on concrete programs and partnership agreements. And we see that in many countries, this seems to move as well. But again, we rely on the feedback from all of you through our groups. I mentioned some on the urban. We also have a structured dialogue group with all of you. And we quite highly value your inputs to the Commission, but again, there is a national level which has to play a very, very important role together with you.
Thank you, Normunds. And I want to come back later on partnership agreements because we have a question from the audience on that. But first, let's stay with research and innovation and the private sector, Erik. Very often it is mentioned that in the EU, we fail to make this connection between research and basic innovation, but then it doesn't reach the private sector and doesn't reach consumers and the market. And this is a particular case, I guess, in disadvantaged regions. What kind of support is there for these regions, and how should they engage with the innovation process? And then I want to ask the same question to David, because you've mentioned that also in your presentations. But Erik first.
Well, this is a question I actually wrestled with all my time as responsible for regional development in my home region, because we could see, and I would say we had really good use of the EU funding when it came both to research and innovation. But the next step, that's the most difficult one. I would say the third step again, when you have a company, when it's has an idea, it's using innovation, it's commercialized its product, then we once again can have use of EU funding. But in between, when you have this really new idea, you have a newly formed company, and you have no idea if this will work or nothing. And it's said that when you walk in the valley of death, we call it, and you never know. And this is where we, in a way, lack both national funding, I would say, and EU funding. But I would say this is so difficult that the only thing that you can do if you want more out of this phase is actually try to increase the amount of money, but also to find more, I would say, regional panels with experience to support these. So you have to come even closer to the companies. And there are two things behind the successful companies: a good idea and a good entrepreneur. And if both of these are not tested, then you have no idea. But if you can find these local regional panels where you can actually test these ideas, then I think you would be more successful in actually coming from step one actually to step two. So I would say the research innovation phase is not really the problem. It's the next phase when you are to put this into a commercial product. Thank you.
Thanks. And David, you have mentioned this in your presentation. How did you address this challenge practically in your development strategy?
Yeah, so I suppose Erik is very articulately expressed, I suppose, some of the challenges, and we would have similar issues, particularly at a sectoral level. Or sorry, some of our strengths in an Irish context are our sectoral vertical strengths. So we have extremely strong national agencies and programs supporting entrepreneurs and supporting, I suppose, testing facilities within emerging sectors in our regions. I suppose the challenge we had from a development perspective was more so to focus on the kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, about, trying to address challenges around, clustering policies, trying to encourage policies that encourage more compact growth so that we can build scale and build markets within our local economies and regional economies. And I suppose that's the challenge for us. And I suppose we're burdened by a great opportunity in that in Ireland, certainly, that we have developed a vision for a national planning framework and a regional spatial economic strategy. So from a spatial perspective, there is an appetite in Ireland certainly to look at subnational spatial priorities. The challenge we're having is similar to other member states, is bringing the sectoral industrial economic policies in line with the spatial policies and being able to kind of grow that scale. So very much from our perspective at a regional level, we see a lot of resources in supporting entrepreneurs, supporting businesses. What we don't have the resources in, and Alison alluded to it earlier on, and I think Normunds did as well, in relation to actually having the capacity within the regional and local institutions to be able to stimulate and understand clustering policy, smart specialization, because the language that we're speaking today is familiar to us, but for most practitioners on the ground who are dealing with businesses, it's firefighting in relation to, administrative funding issues or program and trainings. It's not in relation to macro issues such as smart specialization and policy engagement. And there's a real disconnect, and that's really the challenge for us.
Thank you. Alison, I saw you nodding when David mentioned the challenges of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, really to echo what David has said, I think this is a very significant challenge for many EU regions, and it goes to the heart of what is often noted year in, year out in country-specific recommendations about reforms to research, development and innovation systems. But we really need to understand what is the nature of these reforms. It's just talking about it on a superficial level of supply and demand sides and marrying these up, for example, business speaking, connecting more with research and science sector. We know this for many places, but when we really look at it, and I absolutely agree with David on this, when we really look at the core of what's going on in regions, we actually see rather dysfunctional innovation ecosystems where the actors are not talking to each other, where we don't have clusters collaborating together, or in fact, we don't have industries and individual companies who are better linked to industry associations, for example. And there's a wide range of rather simple measures that could be put in place, but it's not happening. And so I come back to the role of the European semester and increasingly the role of DG reform, newly in place, and I suspect has its work cut out for it, but nonetheless, I think needs to focus very much on what's going on in the core centres of growth within regions and trying to support this, this innovation ecosystem and the improvement of this across the EU.
Thank you, Alison. I want to turn to some of the questions from the audience for Normunds. The first one I mentioned on the partnership agreements. The question is from Vasilis Margas from the European Parliament Research Service. What legal instruments will the European Commission deploy to make sure that partnership agreements are not a dead letter and that local and regional actors are involved in the process of shaping the operational programs, not only in paper? And he would like to know if there are any concrete initiatives that the European Commission is planning to adopt on this.
Well, there is a requirement in our regulations. It's called the Code of Ethics, and the Code of Ethics is very clear. The member states have to have genuine consultations with all partners and stakeholders during the process and also through the implementation. The partners, the key stakeholders, be it at local, municipal level, NGOs, have to be part of monitoring committees during the implementation process. So it's set in our regulatory framework. It has to happen. I think the question there is not about legal requirements and instruments. This is how to make them work in reality and how they are implemented. And this is where I think we all need to work together to put pressure on our national governments, regional governments in some cases, and particularly on our managing authorities, that this process is not just in the beginning to set up the consultation for the PA or program, but that it takes place through the period. And it's in a serious way, it listens to the partners and then brings in changes. And the only way is to really work together. Of course, as a commission, we will monitor, we will report, we will involve our commissioner at the highest level if we see that it's not happening. But it is a lot about learning also, and you know, also of course about making sure that these governance levels work together. But it's there, it's in our regulations, it's a requirement. I don't think we need. What we will do is, though, we have now launched the pilots. We have funded, I think it was already done. Yes, we already had a call for 15 good examples how to involve society in our programming. So we gave grants to 15 projects. I think it was 15. We have a second wave now coming up where we gave money, and the requirement was managing authority, monitoring committee, NGOs, stakeholders, project, how to involve them in this. You know, there were different good ideas, good projects on place. Those are pilot projects, small projects, but we want also then to capitalize on these projects. We want to show when we go out to managing authorities how it can be done practically. So I think, again, theoretically, everything is there. We just have to make sure that it works. And of course, we will use our negotiating power to the extent possible to demand every time that we discuss with our member states or regions, because in many cases, I only have regional programs, for example, in Germany, France, Even in Italy, mostly we have regional programs. So there we need to work with regional authorities to make sure that they also do what is supposed to be done. So I think that our regulatory legislative framework is there. It is about how we implement that. I wanted to say to everybody that also on innovation, the smart specialization concept is, of course, we don't prescribe as you do in Horizon, this excellency principle. You have to arrive at investment from something which is highly developed. We say you can innovate in every field if you just agree, you come together, all the actors in your region that have something to say, you can do innovative tourism, innovative agriculture. So it is about starting from the basics. By linking all the actors together, we call this entrepreneurial dialogue, which is a basic for developing a smart specialization strategy, ideally at regional level. But okay, in some smaller countries, it is at national level. So we try to go more regional. It is a challenge, but I think this concept is well now already taken on board, and we will pursue it further as a key enabling condition. So we will be working on concrete, also with RTD and JRC, our other DGs, on seeing how having this ecosystem of innovation in place is a pre-requirement. And so we will be looking also at some systemic parameters, how it's happening in different regions. And this is a prerequisite for investment into that field. And to Erika, I would love you to come with me next time to Cont Committee. You are from Regi. I recognize the language of Regi Committee. I have to tell you, we want to put in place, we have Urban Innovative Actions, a beautiful instrument where we allow cities to experiment, and it's good, but there is a lot of also demand from the European Court of Auditors, from the Cont Committee to control more, to do everything we can to avoid any experimentation and failures. So let's try to reconcile it. What we will do future is, of course, simplification. That's a key word. We try to do whatever we can. We will look as well as at the gold plating, which takes place at national and regional level. We just launched internally this process to start something there. And simplification is our key requirement. We want to go more for simplified cost use in ERDF. We want to go for more result-based schemes, because that allows that eliminates the whole, possibility to make mistakes under public procurement and all those important requirements. But it's a challenge. Again, we are looking forward to working with all of you under these streams in different networks, and again, teach each other how it can be done.
Erik, can I comment on that?
Sure, please.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'd love to go with you to the Cont Committee, and we have meetings with them also, so we exchange ideas and views. Yeah. But I would like to pick up on because basically I think we fail too little in our programs. We save too much. If we truly want to create new things, innovation, let's call it greatness, then we have to allow for much more failure. Not misuse of money, but actually to experiment even more. And I think I'm prepared to put that suggestion forward, because I think that's important in any good innovation process. And I know in research it is like that, but the only thing that you see in papers is when you succeed. But behind every experiment there are lots of failures, and we have to allow for more failures as well, because then we will truly try to test the boundaries of innovation and research.
Thanks, Erik. One last question from the audience, also to Normunds, again, from Alessandra De Rensis. She's asking, how will the Commission evaluate the regional, local and territorial relevance of investments and reforms in the plans that the member states will put forward? She mentioned that the guidance mentions stakeholder consultations during the drafting process, but it doesn't say much around their involvement in implementation and governance.
I would rather talk about, for example, how we put in place Just Transition Fund, because on JTF we have we have been pushing also member states to go for regional programs, to have genuine territorial approaches. We have platform in place and so on and so forth. You keep come back on the RRF. It is a new instrument, and we are working with a Recover Task Force. You know that it is managed by Recover Task Force under SecGen and ECFIN, and we are trying to give all the information that we have from implementation of cohesion policy funds to them so that they can put this instrument in place in a reasonable way very fast. So we are working with them. And I think they are doing genuine work to try to set up this instrument. I'm honest with you, it's a challenge to do it. It's not easy, but I think it's a good work that they are doing. And so I'm really, I want to say that it's a lot of questions that how it will be done. I think they will have, for each investment priority and reform priority, they will have benchmarks, they will have milestones. So it is a result-based scheme. And we see that, of course, there is a requirement to consult, but let's also face it, they cannot consult themselves, everybody. I mean, it is a national level instrument, so the member states have to do their part. And of course, we are reminding them to do it. So again, I think this is an important instrument. So we have to get it right. And I think many of you stress the fact that the crisis is undermining, so many things in our economies, in our societies, that we just have to do everything to get out of crisis. So these recovery plans are very important in that context. But at the same time, again, as I said, bridging this, to the green transition, green and digital transition. So I think we will see a lot of good components in those plans. We are trying to make them more reform-oriented, these plans. We will be analyzing from our point of view these plans and giving our suggestions to them, and we will try to bring in that regional disparities component into those plans. But yeah.
Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left. What I'd like to do is to come back to each of you and hear from you your top 2 priority actions that you would suggest to ensure that all regions recover from this crisis and that we do not end up with even more territorial inequalities within the European Union. So top 2 priority actions. Alison, would you like to be the caveat and go first? And then I'll go to Erik, David, and Normunds, please.
Sure. Well, thank you, Marta. Yes, I think the first big message, I think, still has to be what we've been talking about today: a territorial sensitivity, place sensitivity, a place-based approach to policymaking is effectively what we're talking about. And I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, because on the one hand, yes, that's absolutely critical, but we also have to avoid patchwork responses where we have lots and lots of things happening at a very local level, which actually would be better connected. And I'm thinking here about infrastructure, broadband, and many other aspects that are happening at local levels, where the head down and looking at what do we need here in our territory without looking at that broader territory of neighbouring regions, or indeed member states, or the member state as a whole. So I think we need to avoid that. And that can be done, I think, by looking at all EU funds. And I very much get what Normunds is saying, is don't think about everything around the Recovery and Resilience Facility. There are other funds. That's true. But if there's no connection between these, then we really do have a problem. The added value has to be in the coherence across that whole funding and policy framework, which is incredibly complicated. I very much see that, but we absolutely need to have that. And I don't think we have that in place yet, and connected to multi-level funding. That was my first message. I'll be very quick with my second one, I promise. My biggest message in this is really what I said at the beginning. If we don't get the financial package right for the current and most urgent phase of support, which is around responding to COVID, not the recovery and not the green recovery elements, that's further away, then we are going to see some of our territories most in need, our disadvantaged regions, struggling to cope with the fallout of the crisis, and then as a consequence of that, shifting further away from a green recovery and the related transitions. So a big plea there to let's get the response right at this stage. Thank you, Marta.
Thanks, Alison. Erik, your top 2 actions.
Well, first I would say is trust the regions, because if we want to do this for real, the state level is almost every time too low resolution. You have to get closer to the action, to the companies, to the people, actually, to see what's happening, to know what has to be done. And from my experience also, it involves that you have to help some regions to build capacity. For example, in the Arctic region where I live, it's not that many people, so we have to cooperate and build capacity together in certain issues, and to build it sometimes with national level and sometimes with the EU level, but to see this more active, that the regions have a crucial role. And they have it now in the pandemic, and they will have it also in the future, to actually to see that and to try to strengthen it when necessary. So I guess that could be 2 or 3 things, that to see the role of the regions and to help them to do this, because then we will be much more successful. And an example. Now, when we see the pandemic and we put up borders because we can see more contagious in one country than another, but when we look down on a regional level, we can see that it can be more differences between regions in a country than between regions on both other opposite sides of a country border. So we have to take that with us as well. This is not the most efficient way to look at country level when we put up borders and we cooperate. We have to make it even more easy for regions to cooperate, which brings me to another favorite topic we haven't talked too much today, but it's the Interreg programs to actually strengthen them, because we need to bring regions people more together. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. David.
Thank you, Marta. I think the narrative around regional development is extremely complex, and I think even just from touching on some of the conversations today, it's very difficult to narrow down on 2 recommendations. I think for me, I think most importantly, I think probably just from taking some notes, I think primarily, I think that the levels of regional inequality is when you look across Europe, as it was touched on today, is leading to, I suppose, the rise in populist politics. We're seeing, we're creating a kind of a space where there's going to be winners and losers. And I think Alison touched on earlier on that, we are never going to get to the green agenda until we address some of those underlying labor and educational factors that need to be continuously addressed, particularly in lagging and less developed regions. So it's really important that member states take their responsibility in addressing the country-specific recommendations by the European Commission, and that we find a way to compel member states to pursue those. And that probably leads into the second recommendation for me, is it's kind of overlapping. Institutional capacity building at a subnational level is critical. We have a tendency to focus our particularly in smaller member states in national departments, and that concentrates, I suppose, knowledge and thinking and innovation at a central level and doesn't diffuse it down. And I suppose if I can, a two point B would be, what measure gets done. And I think monitoring and evaluation continues to play a really important role in all of these programs. And if we're sorry, I'm after getting ignorant. If we don't introduce strong monitoring and evaluation systems for our, enabling conditions around smart specialization with commitments to subnational level, we're going to be here again in 7 years' time trying to demonstrate the value of cohesion policy and the various different instruments of the EU. So we now have an opportunity to do it. I suppose our message is, we need to learn the lessons much quicker than we have done in the past and apply them if we want to get to the Green Deal and the Green Agenda. Thanks,
David. Normunds, please.
Thank you. Well, for me, it's just the one really big priority is to set up the new programming period. And I really rely on the work across between different levels of governance, member states, regions, local urban authorities. This is the first time in our mainstream where we have a specific policy objective, which is territorial. It's the first time, again, after many, many decades. And let's use this opportunity to link and to reconcile these thematic policy objectives with a genuine place-based approach. I think we have that chance for our programs. For cohesion policy programs, definitely. And let's make the use of it. Let's show that it is possible not to talk about the REACT-EU, which should help us to get out of crisis, the JTF, which we need to put in place to help specific territories that go through green transition. And thank you for mentioning European territorial cooperation programs, a subset of programs which is so important for cross-border and transnational cooperation. So my priority is and will be this year together with you to put that in place. This is so important, first of all, to help us to get out of crisis. This is a huge financial flows, but it also, I think, has more than that. It has an impact also, as we just discussed, on regulatory framework, on reforms, on really the different aspects that need to be there if we want all of our regions to go through this smart, inclusive, sustainable development path to reach that beautiful balance, which will leave us in the middle of a donut, as they say. No, I mean, the famous donut economy says that we are living in a donut. So within these planetary boundaries, I really hope we will at some point arrive in that perfect place all together.
Thank you, Normunds, and our time is up. So please, thank you all very much for being here. I think my main takeaways from today are really the need to involve and engage with regions and local actors, not just in the planning, but also in implementing and the governance issues. And taking this COVID crisis, of course, is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to set things on the right track to reform EU funding, not only for forward-looking policies, but also for, as we mentioned, starting again from the basics and get the basis and the fundamental rights in some of the most disadvantaged regions. Thank you very much, Alison, Erik, Normunds, David, for joining us today, and thanks to the audience for a very interactive participation. I wish you all a great afternoon, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for moderating, Marta.
Thank
Bye.
you to
Thank
all
you.
of you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Bye.